All right, guys. So finally, we're on America in the 1990s, 2008. We're finally in what I consider the most important part of history, and the reason is because I'm here. So finally, the world gets to have Mr. Kinnemer, and because the world gets to have Mr. Kinnemer, it's a better place. So let's look at 90s America. What's going on? So we see that the Cold War ends, and the end of the Cold War happened in 1989 to 1991, depending upon who you ask. When Mikhail Gorbachev became the new Soviet leader, he promised political liberty and opened the doors to capitalism. Other Eastern European countries were incurring the same economic instability and unrest as Russia, and they also fell. All the Soviet bloc countries fell within an instant, almost instantaneously. And basically, the borders began to open, and free elections were held, all ousting communist regimes and bringing in new democratic governments. And we can see that with the fall of the Berlin Wall. And what we see is that we get to see the United Nations. And this is where countries got together and they started to try to solve world or geopolitical affairs using using discussion, debate instead of weapons. So basically, a state's participation in international affairs is often used to protect the national interest abroad. So the UN Conventions on Law of Sea, it was opposed by President Reagan and numerous lawmakers because it gave power to a UN commission that that would impede U.S. sovereign security. It could tell the U.S. they couldn't invade X or they couldn't ship Y, and it kind of took over some of the power. But it wasn't all bad. There was some good. The UN was able to keep peace so nations wouldn't be warring each other, and it wouldn't let the big nations bully the small nations. But there were also other problems, like the Protocol, which was opposed by President George W. Bush. And basically, it imposed drastic cuts in pollution. And because it imposed drastic cuts in pollution, the largest polluting states, like the United States, who was producing many new high tech equipment, it would cost them a lot of money with our industry and result in a lot of job loss. So the UN's had some positive and negative, and a majority of the early 90s in America were opposed to its actions. So there are several pros and cons. Pros, they influence international policy, protect American interest, protect American security, and assist other countries. But cons, there's a potential loss of American sovereignty and of their security. So let's look at the very first one. The first major event that happened in the 1990s, it was when Daddy Bush, H.W. Bush, invaded Iraq. And what happened was, you see on my map here, the tiny nation of Kuwait was an American ally, and it was invaded by Iraq. So what America did was it tried to um, convince the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein to move out of Kuwait, to remove his troops. He decided not to. So that's when we got into Operation Desert Storm or the Persian Gulf War. And basically, it was a United States Security Council effort. It was mainly spearheaded by the U.S. soldiers, but it was a coalition of 34 nations that actually fought this. And the war was a decisive victory, and it liberated the Kuwait nation and ousted Saddam Hussein in less than 7 hours. So an entire war was fought in 7 hours. So we also see the Balkans crisis. The Balkans is a region, as you see here, south of Italy and north of the Middle East. It's that southern tip of Europe. In the Balkans crisis, basically, there's a lot of these nations after the fall of the Soviet Union that wanted their own nations. But what happens, as you see on the map here, there's tons of different religious and national nations trying to create their own. You see down here, in several of these nations, they're made up of 4 or 5 different religious groups. There's a lot of fighting amongst them. So in 1995, the U.S. participated in various NATO peacekeeping missions to try to bring peace to this warring region. There's a lot of genocide, a lot of fighting going on. And one of the main things in the Dayton Peace Accords was that the country of Bosnia became stable and be rebuilt. But one of the major things that happened in the 90s was the impeachment of Clinton. President Clinton followed Bush as a president, and he was really considered a very successful president. all the way up until he had a how do I put this high school wise. There was he hmm, people accused him of having sex outside of marriage, just say it bluntly. You see the picture right here. This was Monica Lewinsky. It was one of his aides, and people accused that they had inappropriate sexual contact in the White House. Now, what happened was Clinton lied several times about what him and Miss Lewinsky did, and several evidence kept on coming out about the events. So, the Senate began to question him, and he was almost impeached. He was impeached by the House of Representatives, but he did not get enough votes. Almost, but didn't get enough votes in the Senate to be impeached or to be fired. So he barely got out without being impeached. But everyone knows him. One of the main things now about his presidency is everyone knows him for his scandal. Now I see the election of Baby Bush. Baby Bush got elected in 2000, and he was going against President Gore. Now, what we know is that in 2000, both George Bush and Al Gore were neck and neck. I mean, it was close all the way to the end. One state decided who was going to win. That was the state of Florida. Now, what happened was Florida was declared for Gore, then Bush, then Gore. It kept on flip-flopping. So the U.S. Supreme Court had to step in and rule to stop the recounting because Bush called for recount, and then Gore called, and Bush called. It was so close, it was difficult to tell who was going to win. In fact, it was less than 500 votes, which seems like a lot, but in an election where we're close to, I don't know, we're close to 200 million people voted, that's not a lot at all. And what we see is that natural checks and balances really became a focus of this debate because we got to figure out who would win Florida. And that's who would win um, the election. And what's significant here is that Bush was one of those few people who didn't win the popular vote. You see down here, he actually lost by 15 million votes, the popular vote, but he won the Electoral College. And that caused controversy from day one from his presidency. And we see that third parties, the reason why that it was difficult to elect or to call this election was that there's a guy named Ross Perot. And what happened was Ross Perot took a lot of votes away from both Bush and Gore, mostly from Al Gore. And what happened was, what happened was, he actually won 19% of all political votes, which was huge for a third-party candidate. And what it did was it changed and upset the balance of power. It's sometimes referred to as the Nader effect because the close voting tallies in Florida during the 2000 presidential election, uh, it really caused a lot of controversy because so many votes being taken to a third party instead of the primary two parties. They're only separated by 500 votes. So the challenge of third parties in elections often serves as a catalyst for establishing parties to address issues raised by a third party. So issues raised in the voting election, like the one that Ross Perot was claiming that got him so many votes, the candidates who won were forced to address that because so many people were concerned about those issues raised by third party candidates. All right, so we're going to stop here. We're going to get to modern America tomorrow. All right, see you tomorrow.